In the summer of 1942, the German High Command shifted the primary focus of its Eastern Front operations from the failed drive on Moscow in 1941 to the southern sector of the Soviet Union. This change was codified in Operation Blau, launched in late June 1942, which aimed to seize the industrial and agricultural wealth of the Don Basin, and more critically, the oil fields of the Caucasus. The rationale was straightforward. Germany's war machine consumed vast quantities of fuel, and access to oil from Maikop, Grozny, and ultimately Baku promised to alleviate chronic shortages caused by Allied control of global petroleum supplies and the vulnerability of Romanian oil fields to bombing. On the Soviet side, the Caucasus represented not only a critical energy source, but the Maikop and Grozny fields, though smaller, were significant contributors to Soviet fuel production. The loss of these resources would have forced the Red Army into severe logistical crisis. Moreover, the Caucasus served as a gateway to the Middle East, and a German advance through the region could have linked with Axis forces in North Africa or threatened British-controlled territories in Iran. The geopolitical situation in the summer of 1942 was shaped by the German success in capturing large swathes of Ukraine and reaching the Donero. Army Group South was reorganized into Army Groups A and B, with the former under Field Marshal Wilhelm List tasked with the Caucasus offensive. Army Group A was to cross the Kuban, seize the oil-producing centers, and, if possible, push toward Baku. Supporting formations included the German 1st Panzer Army, the 17th Army, and allied Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units. The Soviets, commanded in the region by the Transcaucasian Front under General Ivan Tulinev, faced the challenge of defending a vast and geographically complex area. The region's terrain varied from the flat steppes of the northern approaches to the rugged, mountainous interior of the Greater Caucasus Range. Defending forces included regular Red Army divisions, NKVD border troops, and locally mobilized militia supported by workers from the oil fields themselves. The Soviet leadership anticipated the strategic importance of the area. By late 1941, defensive lines were under construction, and by mid-1942, additional reinforcements and engineer units had been sent south. Intelligence assessments on both sides played a role in shaping the coming battle. German aerial reconnaissance and Abwehr agents had provided maps of the oil infrastructure, refineries, and pipelines. Berlin expected to capture these facilities intact, assuming that Soviet destruction efforts would be limited or ineffective. Soviet intelligence, in turn, warned of the likelihood of a deep German thrust into the Caucasus, but initially underestimated the speed and scale of the German advance after the fall of Rostov-on-Don in late July 1942. Public sentiment was shaped by propaganda emphasizing the stakes. German broadcasts promised that the Caucasus oil would fuel a decisive Axis victory, while Soviet propaganda stressed the defense of the homeland's vital resources, framing the Caucasus as a fortress that must not fall. Civilian evacuation plans for Maikop and Grozny were prepared, and demolition crews were placed on standby to destroy wells, refineries, and pipelines in case of an imminent enemy approach. By the time Army Group A crossed the Don, both sides understood that the coming campaign was not simply a regional operation, but a contest for resources that could determine the outcome of the war in the east. The battle for Maikop and Grozny was set to unfold against the backdrop of one of the most strategically significant oil wars in modern history. The German advance into the Caucasus began in earnest after the fall of Rostov-on-Don on 23 July 1942. This city, controlling the gateway to the region, was taken by elements of the German 1st Panzer Army, commanded by General Ewald von Kleist. The capture of Rostov opened the path southward along two main axes, one through the Taman Peninsula toward Novorossiysk and the Black Sea coast, and the other toward the oil-producing centers of Maikop and Grozny. The initial movements were rapid. German armored spearheads advanced along the lower Kuban River, supported by motorized infantry and Luftwaffe air cover from forward airfields. Reconnaissance units pushed ahead to identify crossing points and assess Soviet defensive positions. In late July, the 13th Panzer Division reached the vicinity of Krasnodar, forcing Soviet units to conduct a fighting withdrawal to avoid encirclement. Soviet commanders, recognizing the speed of the German push, ordered pre-planned demolitions to begin at Maikop's oil facilities. The Soviets sought to slow the German advance with a layered defense. The North Caucasian Front, under Marshal Semyon Budyonny, committed available reserves to delay actions along key river lines, notably the Laba and Belaya. Engineer units destroyed bridges, mined road approaches, and flooded low-lying areas to complicate movement of German armor. Despite these efforts, by early August, German formations had broken through to the approaches of Maikop. On 9 August 1942, elements of the 1st Panzer Army entered Maikop. German forces found the oil facilities systematically destroyed. Wells had been plugged, pipelines severed, and refineries rendered inoperable. Soviet demolition teams had carried out extensive sabotage, reportedly disabling over 90% of the region's production capacity before withdrawing. The rapid fall of the city deprived the defenders of time to mount a prolonged urban resistance, but the destruction ensured that German engineers would require months to restore output, time they did not have. Following the capture of Maikop, the German focus shifted east toward Grozny. The advance faced mounting challenges. Supply lines stretched over hundreds of kilometers, roads deteriorated into mountain tracks, and the weather turned against the attackers. Luftwaffe support became intermittent as forward airfields struggled to handle fuel shortages and maintenance demands. The Soviets, now reinforced in depth by units from the Transcaucasian Front, prepared strong defensive positions along the Terek River, backed by artillery and newly arrived tank brigades. By late August, German spearheads reached the Terek near Mozdok, approximately 100 kilometers from Grozny. Here the momentum slowed. Soviet resistance stiffened, aided by the terrain's increasing complexity as the mountains loomed closer. The city of Grozny, still operating its refineries at reduced capacity, was being fortified into a defensive hub. The stage was set for a prolonged struggle that would test both sides' endurance in the harsh conditions of the Caucasus. The German High Command's strategic goals in the Caucasus campaign centered on securing a stable and abundant source of petroleum to sustain long-term military operations. Operation Edelweiss, launched in early August 1942 as a continuation of the Southern Push, aimed to seize Grozny's oil installations and, if possible, drive onward to Baku. The Maikop fields, already taken but largely destroyed, were intended as an intermediate objective, while Grozny's facilities were assessed as more intact and capable of faster restoration under German control. For the Wehrmacht, the logistical challenge was enormous. The advancing spearheads of the 1st Panzer Army and the 17th Army operated at the end of extended supply lines that ran from railheads north of the Don. Much of the resupply depended on motor transport over poorly developed roads, which were vulnerable to weather and partisan attacks. Fuel shortages began to appear even during the Maikop advance, limiting the operational range of armored units and constraining Luftwaffe sortie rates. The German plan assumed that once Grozny was secured, the petroleum output could be used locally to support further advances, but this was predicated on capturing the facilities intact, a prospect made doubtful by Soviet demolition efforts at Maikop. Soviet strategic planning in this phase prioritized the defense of Grozny and the containment of German advances before they could reach the Caspian oil routes. The State Defense Committee in Stavka directed the Transcaucasian Front, reinforced by the 44th and 58th Armies, to hold the Terek River line. Defensive measures included minefields, anti-tank ditches, and the use of natural terrain features to create layered positions. Soviet commanders also coordinated with NKVD units to ensure the security of vital industrial sites and the orderly evacuation or destruction of key assets if capture became imminent. Intelligence assessments reflected differing priorities. German aerial reconnaissance identified the Terek line as the last major defensive barrier before Grozny, but also noted concentrations of Soviet armor in reserve positions. This raised concerns about potential counterattacks, especially as the Red Army was receiving reinforcements from the Stalingrad sector. Soviet intelligence, aided by local informants and intercepted radio traffic, tracked the movements of German armored and mountain units, allowing defenders to anticipate thrusts toward key crossings and adjust their reserves accordingly. Propaganda and morale-building efforts were evident on both sides. German field orders emphasized the symbolic and economic value of reaching the oil-rich heart of the Caucasus, framing it as the decisive step toward cutting Soviet industrial capacity. Soviet propaganda focused on the heroism of oil workers, engineers, and soldiers defending the homeland's resources, with appeals to the broader population to contribute to fortification and logistics work. By September 1942, both sides had clarified their objectives. For Germany, a rapid drive to Grozny to secure usable oil facilities before the onset of winter. For the Soviet Union, the firm defense of the Terek line, and, if necessary, a controlled withdrawal that denied the enemy access to critical resources. The stage was set for the first major engagements in the approaches to Grozny, where geography, logistics, and the ticking clock of seasonal change would weigh heavily on the outcome. In early September 1942, the German push toward Grozny transitioned from rapid movement to contested engagements as spearheads reached the Terek River. The crossings near Mozdok became focal points of the fighting. The 1st Panzer Army committed armored and motorized infantry to secure bridgeheads, while Luftwaffe dive bombers targeted Soviet artillery and defensive positions along the east bank. However, the Soviets had fortified the Terek line extensively, placing anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and mortar teams to cover likely approach routes. The first major clashes occurred between 1 and 6 September, when German reconnaissance units attempted to probe Soviet defenses. These engagements revealed the density of minefields and the effectiveness of Soviet artillery fire, which was coordinated with observation posts on elevated ground. Soviet counterattacks, often spearheaded by T-34 and KV-1 tanks, aimed to push German forces back into the river and prevent them from consolidating positions on the eastern side. The fighting was characterized by short, intense exchanges, with German infantry advancing under armor support only to be met by concentrated defensive fire. Civilians in the Mozdok and Malgobek sectors faced immediate consequences. Many were evacuated eastward, while those who remained endured artillery exchanges that damaged villages and agricultural infrastructure. Oil industry workers in Grozny were organized into militia detachments, tasked with assisting engineers in preparing demolition charges for wells, pipelines, and refineries in case the Germans broke through. The terrain complicated German tactics. The approaches to Grozny narrowed as the foothills of the Caucasus range began, limiting maneuver space for large armored formations. River crossings were vulnerable to Soviet artillery, and supply convoys were forced to take longer, indirect routes to avoid constant harassment. The German reliance on captured Soviet fuel stocks became critical, as their logistical lines stretched to over 400 kilometers from main supply bases. By mid-September, German forces held several small bridgeheads across the Terek, but failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Soviet defenses absorbed repeated assaults, counterattacking when opportunities arose, but generally conserving strength for the expected major push. These early engagements demonstrated that, unlike at Maikop, the defense of Grozny would not be resolved by a swift armored advance. The battle was evolving into a grinding contest of attrition, where control of each crossing, road junction, and ridge would have to be fought for at high cost to both sides. By late September 1942, the campaign for Grozny entered a phase of sustained escalation. The German 1st Panzer Army concentrated its armored and motorized formations for renewed efforts to expand bridgeheads across the Terek, particularly near Mozdok and in the Malgobek sector. These offensives were supported by concentrated Luftwaffe operations aimed at suppressing Soviet artillery and disrupting troop movements behind the front. Junkers U-87 Stuka dive bombers targeted supply depots, while Heinkel He-111s conducted medium-altitude bombing runs against suspected reserve concentrations. Soviet forces of the 44th Army and 9th Army, under the Transcaucasian Front, reinforced their positions with newly arrived tank brigades and artillery regiments from deeper rear areas. Defensive depth increased, with multiple fallback lines prepared in case of local German breakthroughs. Soviet commanders employed counter-preparation artillery fire before anticipated assaults, attempting to break up German attack formations before they reached critical points. The fighting intensified in the Malgobek Ridge area, where control of elevated terrain offered commanding views over approach routes toward Grozny. German mountain troops, supported by engineers, attempted to seize these positions through flanking movements, but Soviet defenders used both fortified strongpoints and mobile counterattacks to hold ground. Repeated clashes over ridgelines changed possession multiple times, with neither side achieving decisive control. Civilian evacuation from the Grozny region accelerated during this period. Oil industry engineers completed final preparations for demolitions, installing charges at pumping stations, storage tanks, and refinery units. NKVD detachments supervised these measures to ensure they would be executed fully if the Germans breached the main defensive line. At the same time, local militia continued to assist in constructing fortifications, digging anti-tank ditches, and laying barbed wire obstacles. German supply difficulties deepened. The length of overland transport routes from Rostov and the Lower Don meant that each advance required significant allocation of fuel simply to sustain logistics, reducing reserves for frontline operations. Intermittent Soviet air raids and partisan activity in rear areas further strained the supply chain. The onset of early autumn rains worsened road conditions, turning dirt tracks into mud and slowing the movement of heavy vehicles. By early October, it was clear that the German attempt to achieve a rapid capture of Grozny had stalled. The battle lines solidified along the Terek, with localized offensives continuing but without strategic breakthroughs. Both sides were now committed to a drawn-out struggle in difficult terrain, with the weather and logistical constraints beginning to weigh as heavily on the campaign's outcome as the tactical situation on the ground. By mid-October 1942, the German 1st Panzer Army, still tasked with breaking the Terek line, concentrated all available mobile formations for a decisive thrust toward Mozdok and Malgobek. These included elements of the 3rd and 23rd Panzer Divisions, supported by mechanized infantry and artillery regiments brought forward from quieter sectors. Luftwaffe support remained active, with Ju-87 dive bombers and Ju-88 medium bombers conducting repeated strikes on Soviet artillery positions, supply dumps, and troop assembly areas. Soviet commanders, aware of the German concentration, reinforced threatened sectors with fresh formations, including tank brigades from the 5th Tank Corps and additional anti-tank units equipped with 76mm ZIS-3 guns. Defensive plans relied on holding the line in depth. If forward positions were penetrated, reserves would launch counterattacks to restore them before German forces could consolidate. The Soviet Air Force committed more sorties to disrupt German supply convoys and target forward airfields, attempting to erode the Luftwaffe's local advantage. The fighting in the Malgobek sector was particularly fierce. German units sought to outflank the main Soviet defenses by seizing high ground that would allow artillery to range directly onto Grozny's approaches. Battles for these ridges often lasted days, with control shifting multiple times. Infantry assaults were met by heavy machine gun and mortar fire, and minefields slowed armored advances, exposing tanks to anti-tank fire from concealed positions. Civilian life in Grozny was increasingly disrupted. Industrial workers continued dismantling and evacuating equipment from the oil refineries, while engineers completed demolition wiring across key facilities. Food and fuel rationing tightened, and large parts of the population were relocated deeper into the Caucasus or toward the Caspian coast. The NKVD coordinated both evacuations and the security of industrial sabotage plans. For the Germans, logistical strain had reached critical levels. Fuel shortages limited the duration and scale of armored assaults, while spare parts for vehicles became scarce. The length of supply lines, now more than 500 kilometers from primary depots, meant that any large-scale offensive consumed resources faster than they could be replenished. Additionally, the early onset of cold weather began affecting troop health, vehicle reliability, and road conditions. By late October, despite local tactical gains, the German offensive had failed to achieve a breakthrough. Soviet defenses remained intact along the Terek, and counterattacks continued to erode German strength. The momentum that had carried the Wehrmacht from Rostov to the foothills of the Caucasus in a matter of weeks was now gone. The battle was entering a protracted stage, with both sides preparing for the next phase under increasingly difficult conditions. In November 1942, the German campaign in the Caucasus shifted from a planned, decisive offensive to a series of holding actions and reactive maneuvers. The 1st Panzer Army, having failed to break the Soviet Terek defenses, adjusted its objectives to maintaining current positions and searching for local opportunities to improve its lines. The initiative was slipping as Soviet forces adapted their defensive methods and began probing for weaknesses along the extended German front. Soviet High Command reinforced the Transcaucasian front with additional infantry divisions, artillery brigades, and guards units redeployed from less active sectors. These reinforcements brought fresh manpower to replace losses and increased artillery density along the front, particularly in the Mozdok-Malgobek area. The Soviets also enhanced their coordination between ground forces and the air arm, allowing for faster responses to German attacks and improved interdiction of supply routes. In the foothill sectors, Soviet troops launched limited counteroffensives aimed at recapturing tactically important ridges and road junctions. Although these operations did not yet aim for a broad breakthrough, they imposed steady attritional pressure on the German forces, forcing them to commit reserves to defensive battles. In several cases, Soviet night attacks and infiltration tactics bypassed forward German positions, threatening rear areas and compelling withdrawals from advanced outposts. The German logistical situation deteriorated further. The supply network depended heavily on truck convoys operating over mountain roads, now affected by early snow and ice. Breakdowns and fuel shortages became routine, and Luftwaffe transport flights could only partially offset the deficits. Spare parts for tanks and trucks were scarce, leading to a growing number of inoperable vehicles in frontline units. Medical evacuation was slow, and cold-related injuries began to mount among troops ill-equipped for prolonged mountain operations. Civilian populations in contested areas experienced intensified hardship. Villages along the front were subject to artillery fire from both sides, leading to further displacement. Food shortages grew acute as agricultural production collapsed under wartime disruption, and livestock was requisitioned by military units. The NKVD continued to supervise defensive works around Grozny while maintaining tight control over evacuation and demolition planning. By late November, the broader strategic context shifted dramatically with the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad. German High Command faced the reality that forces in the Caucasus might become isolated if the Red Army advanced westward toward Rostov. This emerging threat would soon influence operational priorities, marking the beginning of the end for the German drive toward Grozny and deeper into the Caucasus. In December 1942, the operational situation in the Caucasus shifted decisively against the Germans. The Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad threatened to cut off Army Group A from its main supply routes, forcing the German High Command to reconsider all offensive actions toward Grozny and the Caspian. The 1st Panzer Army, still deployed along the Terek River, was ordered to maintain its positions temporarily, but to prepare contingency plans for a withdrawal toward the Kuban if the threat to Rostov materialized. On the Soviet side, the Transcaucasian Front saw the strategic opportunity to move from a defensive stance into coordinated offensive operations. Reinforcements included additional rifle divisions, guards formations, and artillery brigades, many of them redeployed from quieter sectors now that the strategic initiative in the south had shifted. Soviet plans aimed to pressure the German front along the Terek and in the Mozdok-Malgobek sector to compel an accelerated withdrawal. The first significant Soviet attacks in December focused on expanding bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the Terek and disrupting German defensive cohesion. Infantry assaults were often preceded by heavy artillery barrages, and the Soviets made increased use of Katyusha rocket launchers to saturate German positions. These attacks forced the Germans to commit dwindling reserves to hold critical points, further stretching their capacity to respond to threats in other sectors. Weather conditions compounded the Germans' difficulties. Snow and ice slowed vehicle movement, and mountain passes became increasingly treacherous for supply convoys. Luftwaffe air support diminished due to both weather and fuel shortages. The logistical strain was so severe that some forward units received only minimal rations and limited ammunition resupply. For civilians in the contested areas, the shift in momentum meant a new wave of fighting and displacement. Villages previously under German control saw renewed artillery exchanges and skirmishes as Soviet forces advanced. In Grozny itself, demolition teams remained on alert, but confidence grew that the city might be held without the need to destroy the remaining oil facilities. However, air raids and artillery fire still posed a daily risk to the population. By the end of December, Soviet advances and the growing crisis on the German southern flank made the continuation of the Grozny offensive untenable. The Wehrmacht's priority shifted to securing withdrawal routes, preserving mobile units, and avoiding encirclement. The final phase of the Caucasus campaign was about to begin, with retreat rather than conquest as the central operational concern for the German command. In January 1943, the German position in the Caucasus entered its final crisis. The encirclement of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad and the Soviet winter offensives across the southern sector made the risk of Army Group A being cut off increasingly imminent. Orders from the German High Command shifted from holding positions along the Terek to executing a phased withdrawal toward the Kuban and the Lower Don. For the 1st Panzer Army, this meant abandoning the Grozny objective entirely and focusing on securing retreat routes through narrow corridors already threatened by Soviet advances. The withdrawal began under pressure. Soviet forces of the North Caucasian Front launched continuous attacks to prevent an orderly German retreat. The Red Army targeted road junctions, river crossings, and mountain passes, aiming to trap German formations before they could disengage. Soviet cavalry corps and mechanized units exploited gaps in the retreating columns, forcing the Germans to commit rear guards and delay actions. The Germans, aware of the danger of losing mobile units, prioritized moving armored formations and essential equipment first. Infantry divisions often formed rear guards, engaging in defensive battles to buy time. This fighting was costly. In several sectors, German battalions suffered heavy attrition as Soviet forces pressed aggressively. Luftwaffe transport planes attempted to supply isolated detachments and evacuate wounded, but worsening weather and limited aircraft availability reduced their effectiveness. Civilians in the retreat zone experienced further hardship. Villages were evacuated or destroyed to deny shelter and resources to advancing Soviet troops. Infrastructure, bridges, rail lines, and depots was systematically demolished by German engineers. These scorched earth measures slowed the Soviet pursuit but left widespread devastation. In Grozny, the oil installations, still largely intact, were finally secured by Soviet forces, marking the failure of the German objective to capture them operationally usable. By late January, the main German columns had crossed the Kuban River into the Taman Peninsula, forming a new defensive perimeter. The withdrawal preserved the bulk of the 1st Panzer Army, but came at the cost of abandoning all territorial gains in the eastern Caucasus. Soviet forces had not only retained control over Maikop and Grozny's oil, but had also forced the Wehrmacht into a defensive posture from which it would never again threaten the Caucasian oil fields. The campaign's conclusion was a strategic failure for Germany, shaped as much by logistical overreach and shifting operational priorities as by Soviet resistance. The conclusion of the German Caucasus campaign had lasting consequences for both sides and for the broader course of the Second World War. For Germany, the failure to secure the oil fields of Maikop and Grozny represented the collapse of a central strategic objective outlined in the 1942 summer offensive. Despite committing major armored and mobile formations to the advance, the Wehrmacht left the region with no usable oil production captured and suffered heavy attrition in men, vehicles, and equipment. The extended supply lines, logistical breakdowns, and diversion of resources to support distant operations had exposed the vulnerabilities of German operational planning when confronted with sustained Soviet resistance and shifting strategic priorities. For the Soviet Union, the defense of the Caucasus marked a significant strategic success. It ensured the continued operation of oil facilities vital to the Soviet war economy and denied the Axis the chance to relieve their own fuel shortages. Soviet forces not only halted the German advance, but also used the winter of 1942 to 1943 to launch counteroffensives that reclaimed lost territory. The experience gained in large-scale defensive and offensive operations in varied terrain, from lowland plains to mountainous regions, contributed to improved operational coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air units. The civilian impact of the campaign was severe. The regions around Maikop, Grozny, and the Terek Valley saw extensive destruction of infrastructure, depopulation of rural areas, and disruption of agricultural production. Evacuation measures and scorched earth tactics left many towns without functioning services well into the post-war period. In the German retreat, bridges, rail lines, and industrial installations were demolished, creating long-term reconstruction challenges for the Soviet authorities. Politically, the outcome of the Caucasus fighting reinforced Soviet confidence and contributed to the broader shift in strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. For Germany, the retreat coincided with the disaster at Stalingrad, magnifying the perception of a turning point in the war. The abandonment of the Caucasus also signaled to Axis allies that the German capacity for sustained offensive operations in the East was diminishing. In post-war historical analysis, the campaign has often been studied as a case of strategic overreach. The decision to divide German offensive efforts between Stalingrad and the Caucasus stretched available resources too thin to achieve decisive success in either theater. The logistical demands of operating deep in hostile territory, combined with underestimating Soviet defensive capacity, contributed directly to the failure. The legacy of the Caucasus campaign also lives on in the memory of the local population and in Soviet military history. Memorials in Grozny and Maikop commemorate both soldiers and civilians who resisted the German advance. For military historians, the fighting for the oil of Maikop and Grozny remains a detailed case study in the interaction of strategic objectives, operational planning, logistics, and the decisive role of resource control in modern warfare.